New challenges await as the world enters 2022. COVID-19 continues to have global political and economic repercussions. Growing geostrategic competition and political upheavals persist in the Middle East, coupled with gradual U.S. disengagement from the region, while global powers and local forces form new alignments. These changes are influencing security dynamics in the Arabian Gulf, as Gulf states now begin searching for new roles for the post-hydrocarbon era. Meanwhile, the threat of nuclear proliferation by Iran looms large. Despite challenges, the region continues to reveal new crevasses of talent, strength, and possibilities. Through 8 virtual discussions that will provide a look ahead to 2022, we bring renowned experts and veteran diplomats, together with scholars from Carnegie centers around the world, to unpack the most challenging issues facing the region and provide their insights on how to navigate a turbulent future. Tune in on December 8 through 9, 2021, to find out what to expect in 2022.
Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us from all around the world. My name is Marwan Muasher, and I'm the Vice President for Studies at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I would like to welcome you all to the 5th edition of the Malcolm Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center's annual flagship conference, Navigating a Turbulent Future, What to Expect in 2022. As in previous years, our conference will bring together scholars from Carnegie centers around the world: Beirut, Brussels, Moscow, Beijing, New Delhi, and Washington, as well as external experts to discuss the current state of affairs and provide outlooks on key regional and international trends over the coming year. We hold our conference this year again under exceptional conditions and in the context of considerable uncertainty that we have experienced for nearly 2 years now. COVID-19 continues to pose challenges to everyone around the world and has resulted in our second virtual conference. Looking at the year ahead, it is clear that this pandemic will continue to have global socioeconomic repercussions, with probable political reverberations. Meanwhile, in our own region, the Middle East and North Africa, growing geostrategic competition, conflict, and political upheavals have heightened polarization as countries try to defend their interests in a rapidly changing environment. All of this and so much more will be discussed over the next few days, beginning with our opening dialogue with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace new 10th president in its 111-year history, Tino Cuellar. Mariano-Florentino, or Tino Cuellar as we know him, arrives to Carnegie having served as the Associate Justice of the California Supreme Court, a law professor and public servant with broad experience in international and domestic policy, the justice system, education, and philanthropy. Tino brings a wealth of experience and compelling strength to lead Carnegie into an exciting new chapter. Tino is also a scholar of transnational regulatory and security problems, American institutions, and technology's impact on law and government. Previously, he was the Stanley Morrison Professor at Stanford Law School and Director of Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Affairs. He served 2 U.S. presidents in a variety of roles in the federal government, including as Special Assistant to the President for Justice and Regulatory Policy in the Obama administration. Before his appointment to California's highest court, Tino spent more than a decade, between 2000 and 2015, in leadership positions at the Freeman Spogli Institute, Stanford's primary hub for research on international affairs. After serving as director of its honors program in international security, he became co-director of the Institute's Center for International Security and Cooperation, and ultimately served as Institute Director overseeing programs on international security and cooperation, international development, contemporary Asia and Europe, global health and food security, and the environment.
Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who's joined us today. My name is Maha Yahya, and I'm the director of the Malcolm H. Kerr Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. I'm absolutely delighted to be opening the fifth installment of our annual conference, Navigating a Turbulent Future, What to Expect in 2022, with the Carnegie Endowment 10th President, Tino Cuellar. In the past year, the world has gone through momentous challenges, as has the region in which we are based, the Middle East and North Africa. Challenges that have shaken some of the economic and political foundations of life as we know it. And this includes, obviously, rollbacks in education and health, that will have significant political implications moving forward. During this year's conference, we will be exploring geopolitical tensions and complex socioeconomic dynamics as they relate to maritime relations around the Arabian Peninsula, nuclear proliferation, excuse me, and the transition in the Arab Gulf towards a post-oil era, while examining how changing regional and international trends will affect Lebanon. Undeniably, President Biden's administration's nuclear talks with Iran, Iran's elections, and the impact of the withdrawal of US forces of Afghanistan are also likely to have major repercussions in this region. And now we're all waiting to see whether the Vienna talks will resume. Over the past few years in the Middle East and North Africa, we have witnessed a continued contraction of open and liberal spaces, the emboldening of autocrats, and the clampdown on thinkers and activists. As massive transformations in human geography and social bonds have taken place, the region has arguably been going through its most transformative moment since the establishment of the modern Arab state after World War I. Disruptions of this order will have immense implications for the future of the region, which is also facing expanding fragility and a palpable and profound sense of hopelessness amongst its populations. We will begin the conference with an introductory video and the fireside chat featuring Carnegie's 10th president, Mariano-Florentino, or Tino, as he likes to be called, Cuellar, myself, and our Vice President, Marwan Muasher. In this dialogue, we hope to engage with Tino on the key challenges that he sees looming ahead in the coming year. These include global inequalities and the way in which he thinks global leaders should respond to the increasingly complex geopolitical landscape in ways that will strengthen international security and promote stability at home and abroad. In addition to his significant accomplishments, Tino's personal history also reflects that Marwan just mentioned. Tino's personal history also reflects the identity of an endowment that is looking to bridge between cultures and spaces in the service of peace. Born in Mexico, he grew up primarily in communities along the US-Mexico border before moving to California's Imperial Valley for high school. He graduated from Harvard College and Yale Law School and received a PhD in political science from Stanford University. In this exchange, Marwan and I hope to discuss with Tino the key global challenges as he sees them, including growing global inequality, and the ways in which the social and economic landscape of the United States is transforming the country's foreign policy. We would also like to talk to Tino about his vision for the Carnegie Endowment moving into 2022 and beyond. In particular, what he hopes will be its major contributions in the coming years. So without further ado, allow me the pleasure to welcome President Florentino Cuellar and begin the conversation.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
It's wonderful to have you with us this morning, Tino. I'm going to begin with the first, and to be opening this conference with you as well. I think it's your first major event also in Carnegie, so we're very proud of that. Let me begin. I'm going to begin with a set of questions. You often reference your journey from Mexico to the United States when speaking about what inspires you to do much of the work you do today. It is both about being in between cultures as well as building bridges. Do you think the same opportunities for migrants in the United States that were available to you exist today? What do you see has changed for migrants in the global north in your lifetime? And what are the important issues for them in an era when anti-immigration sentiment has grown significantly?
Thank you, Maha. And let me say what a pleasure it is to be on stage with you virtually and with Marwan, two people that I think have done just a terrific job getting our organization to be truly global and helping us connect with people around the world. It's also a special privilege to be part of a conference that focuses on the Middle East, an absolutely critical region for the world. For my country, the United States, there are hundreds of millions of people. It's a region that is vibrant, rich with culture, rich with possibility, and reflects the complexities of the world, including migration. So I'm not a week goes by that I don't remind myself that I was born in a country that is in what we could call the global South, that faces a tremendous number of internal challenges around the rule of law, around economic development, economic inequality. And I do believe that many of the opportunities that I've had as a migrant are increasingly hard to come by for many, many people who are migrants. It is true that in countries like the United States, the level of commitment to long-term immigration has fluctuated. The reality is the U.S. has one of the highest percentages of a foreign-born population it's had since the early 20th century. And that highlights that despite administrations that might want to reject the value of migration, the trends have continued to some degree. And I think most American policymakers, and you'll find them sometimes even across parties, recognize that part of what makes the United States vibrant and unique and distinctive is we have links to all over the world because of our level of migration. But it's undeniable that if you look at the European Union and the United States, certainly countries in Asia, migration is a contentious and difficult topic. I worry today that as reasons for migration continue to increase in some ways, not only for security and economic reasons, but also for climate reasons. The developed countries of the world have yet to develop a framework, an approach that really takes seriously the level of need and also the level of possibility. You know, there's no question that when people do immigrate, there's a sort of partnership that needs to ideally take root on both the part of the society they're going to, as well as the efforts migrants make to integrate, to learn languages, to contribute positively to an economy. But the possibilities are enormous. I will point out that we'll talk more about this, of course, but in the United States, there are enormous inequalities inside the country. And some of those inequalities, when I compare my home state of California with Silicon Valley and Los Angeles, to regions of the industrial Midwest that have faced real economic difficulties, you see that migrants can sometimes bring ideas, entrepreneurship, businesses. But for all that to work, I think there needs to be a commitment to an orderly and fair and ideally generous process of migration, as well as the possibilities for integration that include language education. So this is going to be a long-term issue, but I think any country in the world that believes that it can have a geopolitical strategy that doesn't take migration into account is failing to understand the urgency of the moment.
You just mentioned over the past decades, you mentioned inequality, you mentioned migration, but over the past decade, the world has watched communities in the United States, particularly I think this past year, deal with the issue of race in a much more pronounced way than before. What's the state of race relations in the United States today? Do you believe that they've improved over the past decade since President Barack Obama's first term? I mean, we did see the election of the first African-American president. And yet we also had the George Floyd incident and murder, and among other issues that emerged, the Black Lives movement, Black Lives Matter movement emerged over the past year. So if not, what went wrong? How does this issue in the United States also affect the rest of the world and the US and its image in the world?
Maha, let me start answering the question by going back to the migration issue for a moment. So I grew up in California, and if you had told me, so when I arrived in California in the late 1980s, migration was probably the most contentious political issue in California politics. And if you had told me then, as a 14-year-old, that I was going to be on the Supreme Court of California as an immigrant from Mexico, I would have thought that prospect was crazy, very unlikely. Today, California continues to have many problems, including issues of race. But I note that the political economy of California has changed, and its acceptance of itself as an immigrant society is much more well-rooted. People argue about high-speed rail. They argue about our climate commitments. They argue about the extent to which we've managed to find a way to fix public schools. But they don't fundamentally argue nearly as much in the capital, in Sacramento, about whether California is an immigrant society. So I note that because I feel like some of the convulsions and challenges that the United States is facing with respect to the issue of race, and particularly the treatment of African Americans by the criminal justice system, reflect a similar growing awareness of a problem that is unresolved, that goes way back into our history, that frankly reflects roots that reflect some of the most painful chapters in American history. You cannot erase the fact that the United States was a society that condoned, encouraged, and tolerated slavery. And it would be a mistake to assume that simply because we're in some different century, we can simply ignore the after effects of that. By the same token, the recognition that we have work undone, that there are disparities in wealth that affect Latinos and African Americans, that there are disparities in treatment by the police, that there are disparities in access to educational opportunities. That doesn't solve the problem completely. I think in some ways, the awareness in our politics following the killing of George Floyd, in particular in Minnesota, has made the issue more urgent to many and forced many organizations, including our own, to ask, what are we doing to try to bridge these divides? In our case, that includes making sure that as we pull in people who can be part of the next generation, that work on international affairs, that build these bridges between the Middle East and Asia and the US and so on, we are robustly making efforts to include people who are African American and who are Latino, so nobody is left out. But we have a long way to go. It's fair to ask, how do we ever end this, right? And it's fair to say that for the United States, race is going to be a defining political issue for many years, but it will take a degree of commitment across ideological divides to take it seriously, and a lot of focus on the next generation.
Thank you, Tino. I'll now turn it over to Marwan.
Tino, moving beyond the US borders, how do you see the relationship today between the United States and the global North in general, and the developing world and the global South in particular, with rising inequalities, with a technology gap now on the global level, as well as a rise in anti-immigration sentiment in many countries in the global North? What kind of issues do you think require the most focus in order to achieve a just and more inclusive world?
Marwan, this is a critical issue for the entire population of the planet. Let me take a step back and explain to our audience why I feel the relationship between the global North and the global South is so critical. So when I think about the future of my children and the children of people who are on this event, I think about a world that is going to be facing incredible difficulties around security, incredible risks around climate. It is going to have to contend with an infrastructure of technology that is so quickly changing and advanced that increasingly we depend on technologies, networked computers using machine learning and artificial intelligence that are difficult for us to fully understand and control, that are very deeply engaged in making decisions or supporting humans in making decisions about finance, about employment, about security. And we also are dealing with increasing difficulties in finding a way to reach large chunks of the global population that can benefit and should benefit from advances in health, advances in our ability to deliver food. And there is no part of that challenge, of any of those challenges, that can be fully faced if we don't build deep connections between the global north and the global south. So what does that mean? Well, first, I think we have to be aware of the fact that over the last 30 or 40 years, the state economically of billions of people around the world has improved, but it has not improved enough. And what that means is that for the first time in living memory, in some ways, large chunks of the population in Africa, in South Asia, in parts of the Middle East can reasonably expect that in their lifetime, they will be able to reach some part of the global middle class. But how do we achieve that at the very same time that we're having to change the framework for generating energy in the world? How do we achieve that at a time when in many advanced industrialized countries, just to pick two, the United Kingdom and the United States, there are deep internal political divisions that reflect regional changes that underscore the impact of deindustrialization and the precariousness of some people who are already in the middle class and want to pass that on to their kids. So I think that there are three parts to how we deal with this, and it's going to take a generation. And the problem, of course, being that we don't have a whole generation. We have to move as quickly as we can. The first is enlightened leadership in the advanced industrialized countries so that we can make a compelling case to the populations of these countries that their future, the future of their children, depends on the well-being of the global south, on a degree of engagement and partnership, particularly to make the energy transition a reality and not deny people a pathway to the middle class in these countries. The second thing that it will take is technological innovation. Now, I have spent many years of my life in Silicon Valley, where extraordinary ideas come to fruition, and we use data and hardware innovation to change the way that people do things, particularly in areas like healthcare and communications. But we also have blind spots, and ultimately it means building bridges to societies that have different cultures, that are using technology in different ways. But the third thing it'll take is a lot of creativity and innovation in the global south, an ability to partner, to use technology in different ways, to pilot different models of delivering healthcare, to make institutions more limber. And ultimately, I don't forget my own experience growing up in northern Mexico and realizing that we can strategize and partner, but at the end of the day, the biggest challenges in transforming societies have to be undertaken by people who are rooted there and living there. So this will take dialogue, it will take money, it will take action, but most of all, I think it will take empathy and humility.
Another global challenge, Tino, is climate change, an issue which really is recently only creeping into the radar screen of the Middle East region, at least. But it is a global issue, with many citizens, especially in the West, calling upon their governments to take up various programs to mitigate its consequences. What kind of work do you think institutions like Carnegie should be doing to forward this cause and to link researchers with policy and decision makers?
Marwan, for 112 years, we have been focused on helping the world understand through independent analysis, research, track to diplomacy, how countries can better cooperate and avoid conflict, come together to reach shared goals. Today, that challenge extends to climate change. Just as in the 1960s and 1970s, the Carnegie Endowment pioneered a focus on nuclear weapons, the risks of nuclear conflict, how to reduce the risk of nuclear war, how to get nuclear weapons not to proliferate so much. And that took partnership across borders, it took conferences, it took research papers, it took links into government. Today, climate is affecting almost every aspect of social peace and mobility and conflict and risk. If we think about the way societies are organized, the way they generate their income, the way they provide energy, the way they transform themselves to be more vibrant and allow for more opportunities for people to join the middle class, all of that runs through climate. Now, there are many organizations that rightly understand that we have 5, 8 years to get this right without truly courting cataclysmic disaster. But at Carnegie, I believe that we can do two things in particular that are absolutely critical. The first is to link climate to the regions and issues that we have grown truly first rate at dealing with. So we have, unlike other think tanks that have roots in the United States, we have deep roots now in multiple regions around the world. In the Middle East, with its 400 million people, in East Asia, in South Asia, in Europe, and in Russia. And those links, as well as our excellence in climate, in energy in the past, but in particular in nuclear and in democracy, conflict, and governance, will allow us to link the climate issue to different issues we've worked on in the past. Second, though, our special expertise in understanding how policy issues play out in particular regions based on particular cultures, geopolitical conditions, will, I think, allow us to develop ideas that help fill a gap sometimes. And that gap, Marwan, is between the high-level dialogues that occur at places like Glasgow at COP26 that have to do with broad flows of billions and even trillions of dollars and agreements that countries reach, statements of principles. And at the other end of the spectrum are the kinds of policy issues that I dealt with, and legal issues I dealt with in California, that have to do with how you take a commitment that has to be made at the local level, at the state level, to change the way buildings are built, to change the way insulation is actually chosen, to change the way that power plants are built, right? And in between is this question of how do different regions solve their political challenges, work together across borders to make projects happen. So I think about how, in order to scrape by on climate and reach the vibrant kind of equilibrium that we can reach, it requires different regions in the world to figure out how to work across borders, how to take money from one country, have it fund a project that puts solar panels in yet another country to generate electricity for yet another country. And that sort of expertise lives at Carnegie and has to find links into the policymaking process. I'm actually very enthusiastic about this, you can tell, but I want to underscore that for probably hundreds of millions of us who have seen this issue up close, we know that it's personal. So in California, which I think of as one of the most beautiful places in the world, the sky gets dark with the smoke from wildfires that are increasingly exacerbated by climate. We have extreme weather events, and as the scientists draw those links more and more tightly between emissions and weather, we realize that we cannot waste a single day. But obviously, the challenge is staggering, and it requires people to work very well across borders.
Thank you. Over to you, Maha.
Tino, you mentioned several times our nuclear program, policy program, which really has sought to strengthen international security by assessing risks and engaging international actors to affect change where possible, particularly around nuclear deterrence, non-proliferation, and disarmament. In an increasingly crowded, chaotic, and contested world, how would you assess the nuclear threat today?
Very serious. You know, part of what is a real challenge in this job, I mean, it's a pleasure that I get to work with people like you and Marwan. The challenge is that you sometimes realize that the work of our scholars shows that there's a disconnect between what problems the world believes are urgent and important and what problems the world actually needs to face that reflect deep and profound risk. So we can talk about the risks of climate, which are very real and extremely urgent. We can talk about the risks of disinformation across borders. We can talk about the risks that are associated of conflict between countries in the conventional sphere. We can talk about the difficulties in governance and making societies more effectively deal with their internal challenges, whether they have to do with delivering clean water or education. And all those issues get plenty of attention. But nuclear risks don't get the attention that they deserve. We have to remember that we have been living with the nuclear peril since 1945. And my country feels a special responsibility about this because, of course, we were right at the beginning of this journey. And to this day, the world, which has, big powers that have committed themselves to working towards limiting the dangers of nuclear weapons, reducing the risk of nuclear proliferation and nuclear danger through the Non-Proliferation Treaty and in other ways, we have a not solved problem here. It is as important to recognize the urgency of the nuclear threat as it's important to recognize that some progress has been made. The world had, up to 15,000 nuclear weapons. Today, there are fewer nuclear weapons, most of them in the United States and in Russia. Certainly, it's worrisome that about 2,000 nuclear weapons are in a heightened state of alert, and that the risks of nuclear confrontation are generally higher and more alarming than people might realize. And this despite very good, very thoughtful efforts in all the countries that have these weapons to try to reduce those dangers. But I would highlight in particular two continuing challenges, really three challenges we have. The first is to limit proliferation, to limit the number of countries, groups, and so on that have access to these technologies that can be so destructive. The second is reducing the risk of conflict. And that includes reducing tensions among countries that have these weapons, as well as reducing the risk of missed signals, confusing, noisy interactions, and possibilities of accidental ratcheting up of conflict or risk. And then the third is actually working towards a world that reduces the risk long term by making these weapons less and less central to the security picture. And to me, it was rather telling that people ranging from Henry Kissinger and George Shultz to Sam Nunn, an important senator deeply involved with national security issues in the U.S., all of them, William Perry, former Secretary of Defense in the U.S., committed in the U.S. to recognizing that the goal of our world should be to have these weapons abolished eventually. That's a very difficult proposition. I think we need to be honest about the difficulties. But in assessing the relationships between countries that have nuclear weapons, it is always important to ask, how is this issue coming into play? What can we do to reduce the dangers of nuclear conflict? How can we understand these infrastructures? How can we avoid unproductive arms races? How can we deal with things like missile defense in a way that will not exacerbate these risks and these pressures to continue to build these weapons?
Thank you, Tino. Let me move then to a second set of questions, excuse me, around the threat to humanity. I mean, some people argue that the singular threat to humanity is not climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic or a nuclear winter even, but the possibility of an imminent creation of a general machine intelligence that is greater than our own. How do you see the advancements being made in the field of artificial intelligence? What kind of questions should researchers and policymakers be addressing in this domain? And aside from a possible threat in the future, how has automation changed our world so far? And what kind of socioeconomic issues should we be focusing on in the light of this technological revolution?
Maha, thank you. This is an issue I've been following with great interest, participating in research on and in policy discussions about. I think it's important to start by recognizing that today we have a picture of a set of technologies that are affecting our world that is clearer than we did even 2 or 3 years ago. So these are technologies that increasingly involve not only big computing infrastructures that serve corporations and governments to solve problems, but also live on your smartphone. And if you were to go back in time 25 or 30 years and imagine what the computing infrastructure looked like that would actually deploy the computing power in a single smartphone, it would probably take a very large room, probably wouldn't be able to do nearly as much as what that smartphone can do. I'm really struck by the possibilities for positive change that can come from some of these new technologies, like algorithms that deploy artificial intelligence models, artificial intelligence systems. For one, we have to remember that a large chunk of the world does not have access to high quality medical care, lacks access to great teachers, lacks access to good lawyers. So it might be very convenient to say we want all kids and all families to be able to benefit from a live human being who's going to help them solve these challenges. But the reality is, we're unlikely to solve these challenges of making knowledge more available to billions of people who don't have access to that high quality professional without some use of technology. I'm very glad that we can deploy some of this technology to try to solve these problems. That said, I think the risk that these technologies will disrupt and affect social harmony and complicate the security picture are the dangers are real, and we have to take them seriously. And they come in different categories. For starters, obviously, in the transition between a society that uses automation less for knowledge-oriented tasks and uses it more, many people will be displaced. And before those people can retrain or societies can recalibrate policy to make it a little easier for people to get the support that they need to navigate that economy, many people will be unhappy and frustrated. Already you see that disruptive effect sometimes coming from more basic robotics or from international trade. So serious, sustained attention to how different societies might deal with this productively will be useful. Second, as we become more reliant on this infrastructure, we should remember that just as nuclear security and risk is an unsolved problem, so is cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is affecting every institution, almost from small courts to very large corporations to schools to hospitals to everything in between. So the more we rely on artificial intelligence, the more likely we are to encounter difficulties on the cyber front, even if we deploy artificial intelligence to try to reduce the risk of cyber intrusion. There will be an arms race. There is an arms race almost in the use of both tools to infiltrate existing systems and to secure them. Third, and this is the point you asked about at the beginning, we must be aware that as we develop these artificial intelligence systems, they will come to behave in all likelihood in ways that defy our own expectations, with properties that defy our own expectations. And Maha, I'm going to give you an analogy that will be particularly relevant to the Middle East, perhaps, because the Middle East is a region that has been very shaped by the economics of oil. Some countries have it, some countries don't. But the flows of wealth that come from oil, as well as the climate consequences of burning fossil fuels, are long-term impacts on the Middle East. Imagine when we first began to use fossil fuels. What expectations did we have about what the impacts would be on the world? Imagine when we first began to develop the infrastructure of cars and roads. At that point, the discussion would have taken probably two directions. One was that even then, even in the early 20th century, there were scientists who began to speculate that the burning of fossil fuels would create long-term risks, at least to particular ecosystems and maybe to the entire planet. But we also, at the time, understood that the possibility of mobility, of building an infrastructure that would pull people out of poverty, would make the modern economy available to people, was an extraordinary opportunity. I think we face, in all likelihood, similar difficulties in predicting at scale the impact of artificial intelligence right now. And so I do think that it's worth thinking about the risk of building machines that are so smart and so difficult to control that they pose a threat to us. But I think the bigger threat, Maha, is that these machines will interact with us in ways that reshape us in our society, our culture, our relationships with our kids, our security picture in ways that we can imagine right now, but we cannot fully control or predict.
Tino, I want to shift the conversation to the current administration. President Joe Biden is now almost a year in his presidency. How do you assess the performance of the administrations thus far in terms of foreign policy? What kind of signals has this administration sent thus far to the world? And how would you assess the U.S. approach in dealing with global powers such as Russia and China?
Marwan, I think I'm reminded of conversations I've had with my kids, which many of you who are parents have probably had, where you were trying to assess how your child did in something, but you're also taking into account the difficulty of the circumstances that your child might face, that they were injured in a particular day, or that they were running a relay, and they were handed a baton, and when they were given the baton, they were behind and they had to catch up. So I would start by acknowledging that the United States faces great difficulties because of the unresolved challenges that and difficulties that were created in the previous administration and in previous administrations before that. I don't pretend that in the Obama administration, where I worked in the White House, we got everything right. But I do think that things significantly got more complicated in the previous administration because the United States depends for its role in the world on a series of robust alliances with other countries. Some are in Europe, some are in the Middle East, some are in Asia. And almost all those alliances were complicated by the previous administration. In addition, we faced unprecedented challenges that became more and more clear to us during the last administration, including the extent of interference in our own politics from other powers. And further to that, we became more and more aware of unresolved domestic challenges that affect our foreign policy picture. In order to be effective as a force for positive change in the world, the United States needs to be strong at home. And in areas ranging from infrastructure to environment and climate to education, we have much unsolved difficulty. So given all that, I think the Biden administration has been off to a reasonable start. It has helped renew American relationships with our allies. It has identified the climate crisis as an important priority. It has realized that global inequality runs through how we respond to the COVID pandemic, which we haven't talked about extensively, but is very important. And, whether it's vaccine doses or helping innovation happen in pharmaceutical companies based in the US, there's a lot of focus on that. It has begun to re-engage with the trade process of improving the trade picture in ways that reflect long-term economic interests for the US and others. It has prioritized domestic renewal and investment to try to improve the US's situation. That said, are there challenges that maybe deserve even more attention from the Biden administration? Yes. It wouldn't be a very interesting conversation if I didn't say yes, right? So let me identify one, or actually two, that I think three. If we keep going, Marwan, I mentioned four that deserve more attention. So one, we talked about the deep challenges posed by nuclear policy. So I think the Biden administration is rightly concerned about countries like Iran and North Korea, and that's getting attention. But there's a whole non-proliferation dialogue and arms control process that deserves attention as well. And I think that merits high-level attention at the White House. Two, it is clear to me that in the Biden administration, there's been a very robust pivot to concerns and interests in what we call the Indo-Pacific region. Very important region for the world. It's a hub for innovation, for geopolitical change, to some extent for shifting alliances and policy. But at the same time, in Latin America, which is a region that has been core to U.S. prosperity for so long, that affects migration, that affects economic, manufacturing, development, and so on, there does need to be sustained attention on long-term partnerships, not just short-term questions like transnational crime and migration. And then I would add the Middle East, and I'd note that here too, you do see robust U.S. interest in certain areas that are important. Again, I'll mention Iran. I think there's growing interest in partnering with the region to deal with climate. But I do think it's important to see robust continued engagement, and I think the Biden administration has some continued work to do to make sure that comes across.
Well, maybe if we could just build a little bit on this, and maybe if you could talk a little bit more of how you see President Biden's administration at its priorities in the Middle East versus China. We're looking at, are we really looking at the complete disengagement or turning away? We saw what happened in Afghanistan, and yet we're also seeing what's happening in the Indo-Pacific region.
Thank you. There's not a complete turning away. There's continued understanding, I think, first that there are important geopolitical risks that range from developments in Iran around nuclear technology to the continued relevance of the fundamental challenges that face us achieving peace in the Israel-Palestine context. And then there are, of course, governance challenges in countries in the region. Certainly Lebanon comes to mind. And in all those areas, I sense an appreciation. Plus, I'll add one more thing, which is sort of like an appreciation that the region plays an important role in the broader geopolitical picture that implicates Russia, Europe, and China, right? So here, I think there are good, thoughtful people working on how best to keep U.S. engagement with the region. But I came away with great respect for our government when I worked at the White House, but also an appreciation that one of the real challenges in Washington, honestly, is that the time horizon can be very driven by the two or three things that are most in front of policymakers at that moment. And here, I think what you really have to understand for context is that following the September 11th attacks, before that, there were already so many reasons why the Middle East was important. But following those attacks, there began to be such a great deal of interest in the US in Middle East and Central Asia. And that was reflected sometimes in military engagement, sometimes it was reflected in economic flows, it was certainly reflected in policymaking attention and focus on Congress, which also drives things, that there's a sort of recalibration to some degree, and some of that has positive and some has negative elements. But I think that what you will see as the Biden administration further achieves its goals on domestic renewal, perhaps, as well as execute some of its priorities in Asia, you will see a gradual prioritization of an agenda around governance, thoughtful development partnerships, climate, that will have a robust and important Middle East component. It'll take some time, but I think that's very much on the agenda.
I think that's very reassuring for the audience in this part of the world anyway. Marwan, over to you.
Tino, thank you for a very impressive tour de force in such a really short period of time. But I'd like to maybe devote the last few minutes of this conversation for you to, talk about your vision for the Carnegie Endowment moving into 2022 and beyond. What do you see as Carnegie's major contribution in the coming years, considering all the themes that we have discussed and all the issues that are important in an international arena?
Marwan, when I graduated from college, the Carnegie Endowment was a smaller version of itself. It was probably half the size that it is now. And the year that I started law school was the year that Carnegie opened the Moscow Center, which was our first international center. Now, think about how the world looked at the time. People talked about the unipolar moment. They talked about an order driven by, one powerful country and many allies moving towards an economic degree of integration and perhaps a security picture that was going to look very different. It looked like Russia was on a path towards perhaps a very different future than what it's had, a more complex one. And at that time, I began to read Carnegie's work and began to be impressed by the work of our scholars. And if you had told me then that today Carnegie would be operating in 6 different regions of the world with scholars in 20 different countries, even with all the time that has passed, I would imagine that it would have been hard for me to imagine that. It would have also been hard for me to imagine that we worked on as many different issues today as we do. I mean, think about what it means to have this call, like where you were born, where Maha was born, and where I was born. We're all part of one single organization working for global cooperation. And we're trying to do that through knowledge. We're trying to do that through information at a time when the internet is noisy with disinformation, where there are many people who have an axe to grind, an agenda, and don't necessarily have the capacity to give the disinterested insight and perspective. We're trying to do the track 2 diplomacy at a time when the world is increasingly fraught with tensions and countries are coming apart rather than coming together. And so it is humbling, but also very encouraging and a great privilege to work in an organization where just keeping that going, making that a reality, making these events possible is a part of our agenda. Now, looking forward, I also recognize that we have an unparalleled opportunity to serve the world by building on our areas of excellence. I would like to see us be as nimble and good as we are on discussing governance challenges in the Middle East, looking at what's happening in Russia, seeing how we can avoid nuclear proliferation, dealing with democratic governance in different regions of the world. As good as we are at that, I would like us to be at dealing with these challenges involving climate and artificial intelligence and questions involving the global order and the institutions that try to make the global order function for different countries and their different interests. So how to renew institutions like the United Nations and so on. And then as we were able to do that, I'll look ahead, Marwan, and just mention two things that keep me engaged and encouraged. The first one is the ideal of training the next generation of scholar practitioners. Who is going to be the next Marwan Muasher, the next Maha, Yahya? Who are these people? Where do we find them? How do we give them a running start? Can we do that not only in Washington, but in the Middle East, in South Asia, in Asia? And then, as I think about the challenges those generations of leaders are going to have, we have to get through 20 or so extremely contentious years of danger and risk and climate emergency and so on. But if we make it through, what does the world look like in the future? What kind of world can that next generation build that allows for partnership, that lets us lift billions of people out of poverty, that lets us have a more sustainable relationship to our environment, that lets us respect different cultures, but come together around issues of shared challenge? I would love to see the Carnegie Endowment get more nimble and thoughtful at having some of its people thinking about what comes next after those 20 years, as well as how do we get through the next 20 years.
Tino, I cannot think of a better opening to our conference than this conversation. Thank you so much for the time you have given us, for the richness of ideas that you provided. And I and Maha and the Middle East team would love to see you come to the region and come to Beirut, inshallah, soon.
I look forward to it. And I'm so grateful for the work you all are doing. And for everybody in our audience, you're part of the community that we're trying to support. And I'm grateful for all the work that you all are doing.
Thank you. Bye-bye.